It was late September, and I was driving a fully loaded semi through the flat stretches of western Kansas, headed toward Nebraska. The route was monotonous. Endless stretches of golden wheat fields under a dark, empty sky, and the road itself was a thin ribbon cutting across the farmland. The night was cold enough that the cab's heater was on, but not enough to fog the windshield. There wasn't another car in sight. Nothing but the hum of the diesel engine and the faint rattle of the load shifting in the trailer. I had been trucking for years, and this was the kind of night that usually put you on autopilot, routine, predictable, uneventful. I pulled into a small grain elevator that was tucked into a corner along the highway. The place was quiet, illuminated by a few dim floodlights that barely touched the edges of the gravel lot. I killed the engine and climbed down, stepping onto the cold metal catwalk along the side of the trailer. The wheat inside was heavy and packed tight, and I wanted to make sure the load was secure before continuing. The smell of the grain was sharp in the cool air, earthy and almost sweet. I walked along the back of the trailer, running my hands along the tarpaulin to make sure it was tied down properly. That's when I noticed movement in the fields. At first, it seemed like a shadow cast by the low, swinging light of the elevator, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a trick of the light. There was a figure crouched near the edge of the field. It was human-shaped, but it didn't move like a person. It stayed perfectly still, low to the ground, like it was watching. I assumed it was a farmer, checking crops, or maybe some late-night trespasser, but something about it was off. The silhouette was unnaturally thin, and the arms looked longer than they should have been. His back was slightly hunched. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the trailer. The air felt colder, though I knew the temperature hadn't changed. My stomach tightened. I took a step closer, squinting to see better, and that's when it reacted. The figure bolted across the field in a blur, faster than any human I'd ever seen. The way it moved didn't look natural. It seemed to glide more than run, and the limbs stretched in ways that made no sense. It vanished into the darkness of the distant wheat, leaving the field completely empty again. My chest pounded, and my skin crawled, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I instinctively ran back to the cab and locked the doors, leaving the engine off. I sat there, straining to see any movement, every nerve on edge. The fields were quiet again, but it felt like the air was heavier, thicker, as if the darkness itself was pressing in around me. I couldn't shake the image of that figure crouching low, watching. There were no lights, no other movement, nothing to explain it. I kept the windows shut even though the air in the cab was warm and dry. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a hunter, someone playing a prank, or a trespasser who had been hiding in the wheat. But there was no way anyone could have moved that fast across the open field, not in the dark, and without disturbing the tall wheat. I glanced around for tracks, but the soil was dry and unbroken. Nothing that indicated someone or anything had passed through. It didn't make sense. The night stretched on. I stayed in the cab, keeping my eyes on the edges of the field, my hands never far from the door locks. I listened to the wind sweep across the plains, carrying the faint rustle of wheat stalks. The sky began to lighten at the edges as the first hint of dawn appeared, painting the horizon in pale shades of pink and gold. Slowly, the tension in my body started to ease, though the memory of the figure remained sharp in my mind. By the time the sun was up, the field looked completely normal. There was no sign of movement, no broken stalks, no footprints, no trace that anything had been there at all. I climbed down from the cab and checked the trailer again, making sure the load hadn't shifted. Everything was exactly as I had left it. It was almost like the previous hour had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and isolation. I kept scanning the horizon as I started the truck, driving out of the gravel lot, but nothing appeared. I thought about reporting it, mentioning it at the next truck stop, but there was no evidence. No one else had been around. There were no reports of a strange person or animal in the area. I doubted anyone would believe me, and I didn't have proof beyond my own memory. I kept my eyes on the fields as I drove, the image of that crouching figure etched into my mind, the way it had moved, the way it had vanished without a trace. Even now, thinking back on it, I can recall the subtle details. The way the light caught the edges of the stalks around it, the slight curve of its back, the unnatural length of its limbs. I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't human, but I can't explain it. I have no storybook ending, no encounter to report, no resolution. The figure didn't return. No tracks were left behind, and life on the road continued as normal after that night. I kept driving to Nebraska, but I was uneasy for hours, glancing at the empty fields, half expecting to see it again. The feeling stayed with me, the sense that something was watching, hidden, just beyond my vision. By the time I reached my destination, I was exhausted, and I told myself I'd sleep and forget it, but I haven't. Every time I drive across open farmland, especially at night, I remember that figure crouched low, waiting, and I remember how impossibly fast it moved. It didn't follow me, it didn't threaten me, but it changed the way I think about the emptiness of those plains. I've driven that route many times since, but I've never seen anything like it again. I've heard other truckers mention odd shadows in the fields, but no one describes it the same way. No one confirms what I saw. It was real, I know that, and I can't explain it. I've learned to respect the silence and the flat emptiness of those fields, to drive cautiously and keep my eyes open, especially at night. Whatever it wasn't meant to be seen, and I count myself lucky that all I have is the memory. That night in Kansas is burned into my mind, not because it was terrifying in a conventional way, but because it was incomprehensible. The figure, crouched and impossibly thin, appeared and disappeared without warning. There was no confrontation, no noise beyond the wind and the hum of my truck. Just that moment, a brief glimpse into something unknown, something that shouldn't exist in a place that felt entirely ordinary. I've told myself every rational explanation I can think of, but none fit. Even years later, I drive past fields like that and my eyes instinctively search for movement, for something crouched at the edge of the wheat. I still feel the chill, the sudden spike of fear, and the hair on my arms rises when the memory surfaces. It was just one night, one glimpse, but it changed how I view those wide-open fields forever. I don't know what I saw, and maybe I never will, but the way it moved, the way it vanished, the impossible speed, it's something I will never forget. I had been driving since late the previous afternoon, leaving Seattle in the early shadow of fall, carrying a load of refrigerated produce bound for Denver. The cab was cold despite the heater, and the condensation on the windshield made every turn of the road more difficult to see. I kept my eyes moving, scanning the black ribbon of highway ahead, listening to the low hum of the engine, the steady thrum of the tires on asphalt. The highway was nearly empty. Trucks were few, and cars were rarer still at that hour. Somewhere past Missoula, the darkness started to feel heavier, like it was pressing in from every side. I felt the need for a break, not because I was tired in the usual sense, but because the monotony of the drive had begun to dull my senses. My logs were up to date, and I knew I could spare a few minutes without losing too much ground. I took the exit for a rest stop I had never seen marked on any GPS, just a narrow gravel lot with a rusted payphone and a weathered picnic table. The lights were dim, flickering, the kind that made shadows seem sharper than they should be. I pulled the rig into the lot, the crunch of the gravel under the tires sounding loud in the quiet night. The temperature had dropped enough that my breath inside the cab fogged up the windows. I rolled down one window a few inches to clear it, the cold air biting against my skin. I climbed out, the gravel crunching under my boots, and stepped toward the picnic table. I fumbled with the logs, checking the mileage, confirming the temperature of the refrigerated trailer. As I worked, I noticed the fog rolling in from the tree line behind the lot. It was thick, almost liquid in its movement, swallowing the shapes of trucks parked nearby and muting the weak glow of the overhead lights. At first, I thought it was just the fog that caught my eye, but then I saw it, a tall, thin figure, standing motionless near the edge of the trees. My first thought was that someone was stranded, maybe a hitchhiker, but there was something off. The figure didn't move like a person, didn't shift weight from foot to foot, didn't adjust posture in any way. It seemed planted, but somehow fluid at the edges. The fog around it seemed to curl, bend, almost as if it responded to the figure rather than just moving with the wind. I blinked and looked again. The shape remained. I fumbled for my flashlight in the cab, the beam cutting a narrow swath through the mist. I shone it directly at the figure, but as soon as the light landed on it, it was gone. The fog remained, thick and swirling, but the shape had vanished. There was no rustle of clothing, no movement of branches or leaves, no footprints leading into the trees. Nothing, just the empty, silent lot and the fog that had swallowed the figure. Heart hammering, I climbed back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking slightly as I restarted the engine. I kept the flashlight ready, scanning the fog as I backed onto the highway. The lights of the rig cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but the road and occasional outlines of trees. I kept driving without stopping, my mind replaying what I had seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light and fog, a shadow of a tree or a sign. Maybe it was some hunter or drifter crouched in the mist. But it hadn't looked crouched. It hadn't looked like a human at all. The hours passed slowly. I drove through empty stretches of highway, keeping a careful eye on the tree line and scanning the roadside with the headlights. I checked the GPS, confirmed my route, and tried to settle my nerves. The fog didn't return once I was back on the road, and the highway opened up as the first hints of dawn began to touch the sky. I made a mental note to call the local highway patrol once I reached a station. Later that day, I pulled into a way station near Butte. I asked about any reports of pedestrians or hitchhikers along the stretch of road east of Missoula. The officer shook his head. No reports at all. No abandoned vehicles. No stranded travelers. Nothing. It was like the figure had never existed. The more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. I knew Montana roads were lonely at night. I'd driven them countless times, and I had seen shadows and shapes before. But this was different. This had been deliberate, precise, and impossible to place in context. I replayed the moment in my mind again and again. The way the fog had seemed to move, the way the figure had disappeared as soon as the flashlight touched it. I considered every rational explanation. Maybe it was a hunter standing perfectly still, blending with the fog. But hunters wear reflective gear. Maybe it was a deer or elk caught in an odd pose. But nothing I had seen matched any animal I knew. It was too thin, too upright, too human in proportion to be an animal. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched. Not by a person, not by anything I could name, but by something deliberate and unseen. The rig's engine had been warm, the cab enclosed, yet I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. The rest stop had been so isolated. There were no other vehicles, no lights except the weak overhead bulbs, and yet it had felt like I was not alone. Over the next weeks, the memory stayed with me. Every time I drove through Montana, I found myself scanning the roadside, checking the tree line, listening for any sign of movement in the fog. Sometimes I would see shadows in the corners of my vision, or mist that seemed denser in certain areas, but nothing like that first night appeared again. I told a few drivers I trusted, and they all nodded, some saying they had experienced strange things on lonely Montana highways at night, but no one could offer an explanation. The more I thought about it, the more I understood what had unsettled me. It wasn't fear in the immediate sense, it was uncertainty, the impossibility of placing the figure within any logical framework. Highways, fog, trees, and isolation are easy to understand. Trucks, trailers, and the monotony of night driving are familiar. But a shape that exists only to be seen, only to vanish, challenges every assumption about reality I rely on behind the wheel. I tried to let it go, but the image remains. I remember the figure's proportions, the way the fog curled at its edges, the instant it disappeared when illuminated. It haunts me not because I think it was something supernatural, but because I know the world is full of corners I can't always measure. People assume the night is empty when the road is clear, but I learned differently. There are moments, brief and unexplainable, when perception fails and certainty dissolves. That night at the rest stop, I experienced one of those moments. Now, when I drive east from Missoula in the early hours of the morning, I slow down near isolated lots, scanning the tree line carefully. I do not stop at unknown rest areas after dark. I keep my flashlight at the ready, not because I expect to see the figure again, but because the memory reminds me of how fragile the sense of safety can be when the world shrinks to a narrow ribbon of asphalt, fog, and treeline. I never learned what I saw, and I may never know, but I remember it exactly as it was, and the memory is enough to make Montana nights feel colder and longer than they really are. I was hauling lumber from Little Rock to Oklahoma City late one night, mostly sticking to the interstate to avoid traffic, but I preferred driving after dark. The roads are quiet, and it's easier to keep a steady pace. That night, I left around 8 in the evening, the truck loaded heavy, and the cab quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the wood shifting in the trailer. Somewhere around 11:50, I realized I needed fuel. I always planned my stops, but I had underestimated how far the tank would last. I took the next exit, a smaller one, and it didn't feel familiar. The signs were old, the paint faded, and the road itself had patches that looked like they'd been repaired decades ago. I shrugged it off. Sometimes exits change, and I didn't worry too much. At the end of the ramp was a gas station. Its lights were flickering, some of them dim or dead, and the pumps looked ancient. I could see peeling paint and rust spreading across the metal. The canopy over the pumps sagged slightly, and weeds had grown through cracks in the concrete. No cars were around, no lights in the small building behind the pumps, and the smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air, mixing with damp leaves and the faint scent of decay. I parked the truck and went to fill the tank, noting that the pump handles felt sticky and worn. Everything about the place screamed old, but the tank needed gas, and the night was quiet, with only the wind moving through the trees nearby. The more I looked, the stranger it felt. The building didn't show any signs of activity. There were no shadows inside, no flicker from a TV or fluorescent lights. The gas station seemed almost frozen in time, like it had been untouched for years. I checked the surrounding roads, expecting at least some signage for the interstate, but there was nothing. The road leading back looked narrow, cracked, and lined with trees so dense that I could barely see the sky. The GPS showed I was supposed to be on the interstate again, but it spun like it couldn't make sense of my location. I drove forward slowly, trying to find the ramp back onto the highway. The road stretched in front of me, turning slightly, the yellow center line cracked and faded. Trees pressed in on both sides, and the quiet made every sound I made feel louder. The engine, the tires on asphalt, the metal of the trailer shifting with each bump. I came to what I thought was a junction, but the road didn't lead anywhere familiar. It seemed to curve into thick forest, and I caught myself hesitating, staring at the shadows between the trunks. I backed up, careful with the trailer, and tried another turn, thinking maybe I had missed the correct road. It didn't connect to the interstate either. I drove for 20 minutes, taking every small side road, but everything looped back. Eventually, I found myself in front of the same gas station. The flickering lights, the old pumps, the sagging canopy. It was all the same. I stopped the truck, heart starting to beat faster, and checked the GPS again. It was stuck on recalculating. I drove in circles again, taking different routes, but each one led me back to that same station. The sun was gone, and the night felt heavier, darker, the wind sounding different now, sharper and colder through the trees. At that point, I decided to stop trying to fight the situation. I turned onto one of the narrow county roads leading away from the station, heading in what I hoped was the general direction of Oklahoma City. The pavement was cracked, weeds growing through the center line, and no streetlights illuminated the way. The truck felt heavier in my hands as I drove slowly, the trailer dragging slightly with every turn, making soft scraping sounds. The trees grew closer, shadows reaching across the road, but the GPS finally started moving again, calculating a path, though it was indirect and winding. It took nearly an hour of driving along those back roads, twisting through hills and forests, before I reached a familiar town. The relief was almost physical. Streetlights, houses, the soft hum of occasional traffic. It all made the world feel solid again. I pulled into a gas station in town, this one modern and lit properly, and sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. The old station, the looping roads, the way the GPS refused to work. I had never experienced anything like it. I checked the map carefully, tracing my route in my head. On paper, that exit didn't exist. There were no signs indicating a ramp that led to a station like that. Nothing that matched the small cluster of roads I had driven. When I got back to the company, I told them what happened. They shrugged it off, assuming I was tired or overworked, imagining that I had misread the signs or taken the wrong exit in exhaustion. They had no reason to think otherwise, and after hours of driving, fatigue can make anyone doubt their senses. I tried to explain the details, the lights, the pumps, the roads that circled back, but there was no way to prove it. I've driven that route dozens of times since. I check that exit whenever I pass, careful to see if it might reappear. It never does. Interstate exits remain as they should. The signs are consistent. The ramps lead where they're supposed to lead. The county roads are straightforward, and nothing matches the paths I took that night. I can still picture the flickering lights, the sagging canopy, the way the air smelled heavy with gas and something else, damp and metallic. It was real. I know it was real even though it defies explanation. There was no one there. Nothing moved besides the trees in the wind and my own truck. I passed through that patch of roads, saw that station, and felt something in the air shift. An odd pressure, like the world had folded slightly in on itself. It wasn't supernatural. It didn't involve ghosts or monsters. It was just a place, a moment, a set of roads and lights that shouldn't have been possible, and yet I was there. Since that night, I drive more carefully. I plan fuel stops with extra caution. I still avoid the late-night hours if I can, and I always keep that memory in mind because the world can feel familiar and solid, but it doesn't always behave the way we expect. Sometimes, even a routine run from Little Rock to Oklahoma City can make you question what you know about the road beneath your wheels. That exit is gone now, but I carry it in my memory every time I drive. It's a reminder that even on familiar routes, the world can still surprise you, quietly, without warning, and leave you questioning what is real. I've thought about it countless times, traced maps, asked locals, checked old county records. There is no old gas station, no lost exit, no missing road. And yet, every detail, every feeling, every moment from that night is locked in my memory as sharply as the edge of the steering wheel under my hands, the way the tires gripped the asphalt, and the cold wind pressing against the cab. It is, in every way, completely real. I just can't explain it. I had a hot load of construction equipment to deliver to a small town outside Austin, a shipment that had to get there before sunrise to keep the project on schedule. The truck was heavy, the trailer stacked with compact excavators, skid steers, and pallets of steel, all tied down with chains that rattled with every bump. I left the warehouse in the late evening, the sky already dark and the stars dim behind a thin layer of clouds. The route took me through an old highway that cut through ranchland, long stretches of open fields, fences, and scattered farmhouses. The kind of road that felt empty even in the middle of the day, and at night it felt like it went on forever without anyone else noticing you existed. The highway was narrow, 2 lanes with faded paint and rough patches that shook the cab with every mile. I had driven it before, but never with a load this heavy, and I knew every dip and rise in the asphalt. The temperature had dropped, the air crisp against the windows, and the smell of diesel and metal filled the cab. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, checking the mirrors, feeling the weight of the trailer behind me, making sure it wasn't swaying. It started gradually, a subtle change in how the brakes felt under my foot. At first, I thought it was just the truck adjusting to the weight, or maybe the pads were warm from climbing the small inclines earlier. But then, as I started down a steep hill, I realized it was something worse. I pressed the brake pedal harder and harder, and it went nearly to the floor without slowing the truck. My heart jumped. I pumped the pedal, trying to force some pressure into the system, but it didn't respond. The trailer behind me felt heavier with every second, pushing me faster. The road ahead narrowed into a bend, dropping steeply toward a creek that cut across the ranch. There were no guardrails, just a ditch and a muddy bank that disappeared into the trees. I could feel the truck picking up speed, the engine straining, the tires squealing slightly against the asphalt. I grabbed the gear shifter and slammed it into neutral, trying to slow the momentum without sending the load into a dangerous skid. My fingers were tight around the wheel, my knuckles white. I yanked the emergency brake, the handle grinding in protest, but the weight of the trailer kept pushing forward. It was then I saw him. On the right side of the road, on the edge of a field, a man on horseback was standing completely still. The horse was as quiet as the man, barely shifting its weight, its ears flicking slightly. The rider wore a wide-brimmed hat, and even in the dark I could make out the outline of his long coat. He wasn't moving, not even his head, just staring at me. My first thought was that it was some rancher, someone who had seen the truck coming and stopped to watch. But his stillness didn't make sense. His eyes caught the dim light from the truck's headlights, and for a moment I felt pinned, like he was calculating something, though I didn't know what. The hill was unforgiving. The brakes barely worked, and the trailer behind me felt like a runaway train. I had seconds to react. I swerved slightly to the left, hoping to find a soft patch of grass or dirt to slow the truck. The tires hit the edge of the field, the mud sucking at the wheels, the trailer chains rattling with a harsh metallic clang. The cab shook violently, the vibration running through my chest. I held the wheel with everything I had, adjusting, correcting, trying not to flip. The mud slowed the truck just enough to give me a tiny margin. I felt the vehicle dig into the soft ground, the weight of the load pressing down, the tires churning as I fought to bring it to a stop. When the truck finally slowed to a crawl, my chest was tight, my breathing harsh. I eased the emergency brake further, letting the truck settle fully into the mud. The trailer leaned slightly, the chain straining, but everything held. I shut the engine off and sat there, gripping the wheel, sweat cooling on my forehead despite the cold air. My hands shook, and I could still hear the faint echo of the engine in the tires as they slowly sank into the mud. I glanced to the side, expecting to see the rider, but he was gone. There was no sign of the horse, no tracks in the mud that could indicate where he had gone. The field was empty. The only movement, the swaying grass in the breeze and the distant sound of water from the creek at the bottom of the hill. I felt the weight of how close I had come, the near miss that could have been fatal. I stepped out onto the muddy ground, testing the hold beneath my boots. The earth had absorbed the truck, the trailer leaning slightly but stable. I walked around the cab, inspecting the load. Everything was intact, the chains still taut, the machines undamaged. I took a deep breath, the smell of diesel and wet earth filling my lungs, and tried to make sense of what I had seen. The rider had been real enough, but his sudden disappearance didn't make sense. There was no road or path where he could have disappeared to, no way for him to have vanished without crossing the field. I thought about stopping and looking for tracks, but the adrenaline was still high, and I didn't want to risk moving too far in the dark on soft ground with the creek nearby. Eventually, I climbed back into the cab, double-checking the brakes, which now responded weakly but enough to allow me to crawl forward. I inched the truck back onto the asphalt, the trailer swaying slightly as I adjusted my speed. The field behind me looked normal again, empty and quiet, nothing to explain what I had seen. I kept my eyes on the road, alert for anything else that might appear, every shadow and movement catching my attention. The rest of the drive to Austin felt endless, the weight of the night pressing down, the image of the rider burned into my mind. When I finally reached the small town, delivered the equipment, and parked the truck at the job site, I sat in the cab for a long time trying to shake off the memory. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a farmer in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the stillness, the way he had stared, didn't feel like an accident. I checked the brakes at the yard. Everything seemed fine. No leaks, no mechanical issues that could explain the failure. I left the truck there and walked away, the sound of my boots on the gravel a steady rhythm in the quiet town. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in pale pink and orange, and the ranchlands I had driven through the night before were hidden in shadows. I never saw the rider again, and the field where I had stopped remained empty when I drove past weeks later. The memory lingered, not as something supernatural, but as a sharp, terrifying reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when you're alone on a dark highway, a heavy load behind you, and the world feels like it has stopped to watch. The truck could have gone over the creek, the bend could have ended me in a heap of twisted metal, and I could have been another statistic. I had no explanation for the rider, and maybe there wasn't one. The only thing I knew was that I had been lucky, and that night on the hill would stay with me every time I drove through ranchland alone. The memory of still eyes on the side of the road, watching me, a silent presence that reminded me how fragile control can be when it matters most. Even now, years later, I can't think about that highway without my chest tightening. The memory of pumping brakes that refused to respond, of swerving into mud to survive, and of that man on horseback, still and silent, is sharper than any mechanical detail or road map. It was a night that tested every instinct I had. A night where luck and caution met a force I could never explain, leaving me with the simple truth that some things can be real and terrifying without ever needing an answer. I was driving a loaded tractor-trailer from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, hauling a shipment of large paper rolls. The cargo was heavy and awkward, the kind that made the trailer sway slightly in the wind if I wasn't careful. My co-driver and I had been alternating shifts, but by the time we hit central Pennsylvania, the sky had turned a dull gray, and a fine sleet was falling. The roads had already started to glaze over, and visibility was dropping in that thin, misty veil that sticks to your windshield. I kept my speed down, watching for black ice and the occasional abandoned sedans sliding off the road. Originally, we were supposed to take the interstate, but a bridge closure forced us onto a network of smaller, back roads. I didn't know the area well, but GPS had patched together a route that looked reasonable enough. The road narrowed after a few miles, tree branches hanging low, slick with ice, the occasional puddle frozen over like glass. I could feel the truck leaning slightly with each turn, the tires gripping the slick asphalt with a tension I couldn't shake. My co-driver stayed quiet, scanning the road. The hum of the diesel engine and the rhythm of the wipers were the only sounds in the cab, a constant white noise that made me focus harder on the road ahead. After a while, the road curved toward a small steel bridge that spanned a shallow creek. It was old, rusted, with planks along the edges missing, exposing the dark water below. The paint had peeled decades ago, and ice had started to coat the metal beams. My stomach tightened when I saw the gaps between the planks. They weren't wide enough to fall through, but just seeing them made me conscious of every wheel placement. I slowed to a crawl, almost holding my breath as the tires hit the first section of the bridge. That's when it started. There was a sound beneath the truck, a scraping, dragging noise, uneven, like something was dragging claws across metal. My first thought was that it was just ice, maybe a loose metal flap caught under the chassis, but the rhythm didn't match the usual scrapes I'd heard from road debris. My co-driver shrugged silently, focused on his side of the windshield, but I could see the tension in his hands tightening on the dashboard. We had both been on the road long enough to know that silence and sudden noises like that weren't to be ignored. Halfway across the bridge, I leaned slightly forward to check the edges through the side mirrors, trying to spot any debris, any hazard. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved under the bridge, not in the water, but under the planks themselves. It shifted in a way that suggested a figure crouched low, stationary, observing us. I blinked and looked again, trying to convince myself it was just the reflection of the truck's lights on the wet wood or a trick of the shadows cast by the metal beams. But the shape moved with purpose, keeping pace in a manner that made no sense for debris or wildlife. My heart started pounding. I kept my eyes forward, driving as steadily as I could, but the sense that someone, or something, was watching me from directly beneath the truck made every second stretch unbearably long. The scraping continued, uneven and deliberate. The sound was magnified in the hollow space under the bridge, bouncing off the rusted metal and splintered wood. I could feel the vibration through the steering wheel, subtle but persistent, and I couldn't shake the thought that the bridge itself was not the only thing underneath the truck. I kept the wheel steady, every muscle tense, knowing that stopping or slowing too much could make the figure react. I could see the end of the bridge approaching, the narrow gap between the guardrails opening into the main road again. Without thinking, I pressed the accelerator slightly, urging the truck forward faster than I wanted on slick ice. My co-driver did the same instinctively, the cab tense with unspoken agreement that neither of us would acknowledge the figure we had just seen. The scraping faded behind us as we reached the far side, but the memory of it lingered, crawling along the back of my neck like ice in my spine. We didn't stop. The road ahead opened into a stretch of open fields, the highway lights dim and distant. I kept my eyes on the asphalt, trying to shake the adrenaline, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the shadow. The sleet had stopped briefly, leaving the road shiny and treacherous. I could feel the truck's weight pressing against the tires, the trailer shifting slightly with each tiny correction. Every crack of ice, every faint echo from the tires on wet patches, made me flinch, half expecting the shadow to reappear. It was 20 miles before we saw the glow of a gas station. By then, both of us were quiet, tense, the cab filled with the smell of heated diesel and wet fabric from our jackets. I parked as far away from the pumps as I could, checking the mirrors repeatedly before turning off the engine. The silence outside felt oppressive, the kind that pressed down with a weight you could feel in your chest. Neither of us spoke as we climbed out, the crunch of wet gravel under our boots loud in the still air. We didn't linger, didn't look back. Inside the gas station, with the warmth and bright fluorescent lights, the tension started to ebb. My co-driver got coffee while I checked the trailer and tires, making sure everything was intact. Nothing had shifted, nothing was loose, no damage to the truck. It was as if the scraping and the shadow hadn't existed. I thought about calling the company to report a possible obstruction on the bridge, maybe a fallen branch or a deer. The thought made my hands shake slightly. Whatever had been under the bridge wasn't ordinary, at least not in the way I'd ever seen. It didn't make sense to anyone who wasn't there. Standing on that slick metal, hearing the sound, seeing the movement. I stayed at the pumps longer than necessary, sipping coffee, checking the truck again, scanning the highway for any signs of danger. But there was nothing. Just empty roads stretching into the night, pale light reflecting off wet asphalt. Eventually, we continued, the highway smoother, the load secure. The memory of the shadow remained, but I buried it under procedure, under focus on the road and the cargo. By the time we rolled into Pittsburgh, daylight was breaking. The rain had stopped, the roads clearer. I parked the truck, checked the roll positions, and finally allowed myself to breathe fully. We had delivered the load intact, no accidents, nothing lost. The terror of those few minutes on the bridge faded with the morning light, reduced to a memory that felt more like a trick of fatigue and sleet. But I still drive that route in my mind. I can still feel the scrape beneath the truck, the shadow under the planks, the narrow boards, and the gap between what's real and what you think you saw. It was a simple back road, a reroute, and yet those minutes felt longer than any hours on the highway. The bridge is still there, waiting for the next driver, the next truck, and I imagine they might hear the same sound, feel the same unease. I never went back to that road at night. I never needed to. What mattered was knowing I made it across, intact, with a load delivered and a story that I can tell without embellishment. The fear was real, but so was the relief that followed, sharp and clean, like the first warm coffee in the morning after hours of cold, sleepless driving. The bridge never looked quite the same in daylight. The missing planks, the rusted steel, the water running beneath. It was ordinary now, harmless. But I know what I saw that night. I know what I heard. And I know that some stretches of road, especially in sleet and darkness, carry more than just pavement and bridges. They carry moments that will stay with you long after the tires have rolled over them. It was early March, just past 5 in the morning, and I was hauling a load of frozen seafood to Portland. The night had been unusually clear, with the stars still fading in the sky as I drove through the outskirts of rural Oregon. My route was the kind I usually avoided, a shortcut through narrow, forested backroads. My GPS insisted it would save time, but I already knew shortcuts like this were usually slower. Still, the road was paved, quiet and straight enough, so I figured I'd take the gamble. The temperature had been dropping overnight, leaving a thin glaze of frost on the shoulders of the road, and the air smelled sharply of pine and damp earth. My rig hummed under me, the trailer rattling slightly with the ice-packed boxes shifting as I braked gently around corners. By the time the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I noticed a small clearing on the right side of the road. There was a cabin there, small and squat, with smoke curling lazily from a chimney. I froze in the driver's seat, staring. It hadn't been on the map, and I had driven these roads enough times to know the general layout. I thought maybe a farmer or a hunter had built it, but the place looked too neat, too intentionally hidden among the tall firs and spruces. The windows were fogged over with condensation. I could make out shapes inside, though it was impossible to tell what they were. My curiosity got the better of me. I slowed the truck, pulled off the road onto the muddy shoulder, and killed the engine. The quiet of the forest was thick, broken only by the occasional bird or the distant sound of rushing water, probably a creek. I stepped out, the air biting at my face and hands, the ground soft under my boots. The mud around the truck was sticky, clinging to my soles as I walked toward the clearing. As I approached, I noticed the ground was disturbed. Tracks led from the road toward the cabin, but they weren't human. They were deep, long, with claw-like impressions that sank into the mud. I crouched to look closer, running my hand along the edges. They were too uniform, too deliberate to be some animal passing through. I couldn't tell how long ago they had been made, but the mud was still soft enough that the impressions were crisp. My skin prickled, and I felt a sudden weight in my chest, a tension I couldn't shake. The smoke from the chimney swirled lazily above the roof, but there was no sound from the cabin itself. No creak of a door, no bark of a dog, no distant voice. Just silence and the low hum of my truck behind me. I glanced back toward the road, considering whether I should just get back inside and leave, but something made me look at the cabin again. The condensation on the windows shifted slightly, and I thought I saw movement inside. A shadow, low and elongated, crossing the pane. It didn't move like a person, at least not how I recognized people moving. My heart rate sped up, the instinct to get out of there clashing with the need to see what was happening. I took a step closer, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I noticed how the tracks ended. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing. Then there was nothing. No footprints leading back to the cabin, no path away. Just mud that seemed untouched beyond that. I straightened up and started to circle the cabin slowly, keeping my distance. The clearing was small, the trees dense beyond its edge, and every step I took made a dull crunch in the frost-hardened earth. I thought about knocking, about calling out, but my voice sounded absurdly loud in the quiet. The figure I thought I had seen through the window didn't appear again. I moved to the far side of the cabin, trying to catch a better glimpse, but when I looked back, the structure seemed to shift. The roofline, the walls, even the smoke rising from the chimney, they didn't match what I had seen before. My stomach dropped. I stepped back, frowning, convinced I was imagining things. I had been awake all night, the monotony of driving and the cold air leaving my mind slightly off. That had to be it. I turned to retreat to the truck, but something about the clearing had changed. The space that had seemed open and accessible now felt cramped, the trees closer together than they had a minute ago. I squinted through the morning haze, and for a heartbeat, I could swear the cabin wasn't there anymore. The smoke had vanished, the roofline blurred among the firs, leaving nothing but trees and frost-covered undergrowth. I froze, my breath fogging the air, and forced myself to step closer to where it had been. Nothing, just a clearing, the ground firm and covered in pine needles, the mud tracks I had seen nowhere to be found. The forest looked ordinary, untouched, like no one had passed through in years. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and climbed back into the truck without a second thought. I sat there with the engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the spot where the cabin had been. The road ahead seemed impossibly long and empty. When I finally started moving again, I drove slowly, constantly glancing to the side. There was nothing. No signs of human activity, no cabin, no smoke, no tracks. Just forest stretching into the distance, as if the morning had swallowed the clearing whole. By the time I reached the outskirts of Portland, I tried to explain it to myself. Stress, exhaustion, the early hour, my mind playing tricks after hours of driving through the same kind of scenery. I told myself I must have seen a hunting cabin in someone's backyard, Or an abandoned structure I didn't notice before. Maybe I had misread shadows, or the fog on the windows of my cab had made shapes where none existed. That seemed logical enough, but the memory of those tracks, the way they ended abruptly, lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. Later, I asked locals about that stretch of road. I mentioned the clearing, the cabin, the smoke, even the tracks. No one had ever heard of it. There were no cabins along that back road. No hidden homesteads. Nothing that matched my description. They looked at me like I was imagining things. Some said it was dense forest, hard to find clearings, but no one could account for smoke or a structure. I drove the route again during the day, following the same path my GPS had led me through. The road was there exactly as it had been, but the clearing was gone. Every tree stood in place, the undergrowth unbroken. Nothing indicated a cabin had ever existed. No flattened grass, no chimney remnants, not even disturbed mud. It was as if I had dreamed the whole encounter in the early morning haze. I still drive that route occasionally. The memory of the cabin lingers, a quiet knot of unease in my chest. I've learned not to stop on that stretch before sunrise, and I never stray from the main road when the fog sits low over the treetops. I have no explanation for what I saw, no reason to doubt that it was real, but I also have no proof it ever existed. The forest there is old, the land uneven, the shadows long and shifting at dawn. That day, whatever I saw, whatever I got a glimpse of, it stayed hidden again before I could understand it. All I know is that for a brief moment, something existed in that clearing that should not have, and I can't tell anyone because if I did, they'd say I imagined it. I can't say that myself because I know what I saw. It's out there in the forest, or at least it was, and part of me is certain I'll never see it again, no matter how many times I drive that road. The unease has faded over time, but it hasn't disappeared. I don't drive that stretch at dawn anymore. I stick to main highways, to familiar routes, to places where nothing can disappear while I'm looking at it. But every now and then, in the still hours before the sun rises, I remember the way the smoke rose and the shape in the window, and I remember those tracks in the mud that didn't make sense. And I know, with a certainty that no logic can shake, that I saw something real, something grounded in this world, and yet it vanished entirely before I could understand it.